quiet town, a trusted daughter, and a single night that would fracture a community for decades. On the evening of April 12, 1985, Ravenwood, Illinois, was as ordinary as any small Midwestern town could be. Rows of modest brick homes lined the streets, American flags waved gently from front porches, and the spring air carried the smell of freshly cut grass mixed with the faint smoke of backyard barbecues. Families were winding down their days, televisions hummed with the nightly news, and radios spilled out the familiar crackle of a Cubs game. It was the kind of place where people left their cars unlocked, where everyone knew each other's names, and where the thought of violence seemed almost unthinkable. But for the Drake family, April 12th was no ordinary night. It was the night their 17-year-old daughter, Allison Drake, vanished. As we open this case file together, remember to like and subscribe to the Cold Case Archive, so stories like this are never forgotten. Allison wasn't the kind of teenager people worried about. She was dependable, thoughtful, and fiercely protective of her younger sister, Hannah, who was only 13 at the time. Her parents, Margaret and Charles Drake, often said she carried herself with a maturity beyond her years. At Ravenwood High, Allison was a strong student with a natural gift for writing. Teachers encouraged her to pursue journalism, and she dreamed of one day studying at Northwestern University. She was already working on her college application essays, carefully storing them in a folder by her desk. Friends described her as the girl who always carried a book in her bag, who never left without her canvas backpack, and who seemed to have a smile ready for anyone. She worked weekends at the Greenfield Market, the local convenience store where people stopped not only for groceries and cigarettes but also for gossip and neighborly chatter. By the spring of 1985, Allison's life seemed full of promise. Graduation was weeks away. Summer plans were taking shape. And yet, beneath the surface, there were whispers, a recent breakup with her boyfriend, arguments that left her uneasy, and moments when her close friends noticed a shadow in her usually bright demeanor. April 12th was a Friday. The kind of evening when teenagers in Ravenwood looked forward to football games, diner milkshakes, and long drives down back roads. Allison, however, was scheduled for the closing shift at Greenfield Market. She arrived on time, wearing her denim jacket over a white blouse, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Co-workers later recalled nothing unusual. Allison was her usual polite, hard-working self, chatting with customers and tidying shelves as the store wound down for the night. By 9 p.m. she was finished. She clocked out, waved goodbye to the assistant manager, and stepped into the cool spring night. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few cars belonging to late-night shoppers. Allison carried her books and slipped her arms through the straps of her canvas backpack. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. Back at the Drake home, dinner was waiting. Margaret had cooked Allison's favorite, roast chicken with mashed potatoes. Hannah sat cross-legged in the living room, playing one of Allison's records, hoping her sister would join her when she came through the door. But the minutes dragged on. Then hours. By 11 p.m., Margaret was pacing the kitchen, her eyes fixed on the clock above the stove. Charles drove the streets of Ravenwood, retracing Allison's usual route home, but found no trace of her. At first, they clung to rational explanations. Maybe she stopped at a friend's house. Maybe she decided to study late. Maybe she'd lost track of time. But as midnight passed and no call came, dread seeped into their bones. The Drakes phoned a few of Allison's closest friends. None had seen her. None had spoken to her. By 2 a.m., they contacted the Ravenwood Police Department. Officers took the report, but in those early hours they suggested the same thing they always did with teenagers. Maybe she had run away. But the Drakes knew their daughter. Allison wasn't the type to disappear without a word. Morning light brought no relief. Margaret searched Allison's room, hoping for a note, a clue, anything, but everything was in place. Her essays, her neatly stacked textbooks, even her carefully folded clothes. By noon, neighbors joined the effort. Ravenwood was small enough that Allison's absence spread quickly. Search parties formed, scanning the wooded areas and country roads. Police drove patrol cars along the town's perimeter, calling her name through rolled-down windows. Then, a chilling discovery. A fisherman along Maplewood Lake, just outside town, noticed something unusual on the bank, a canvas backpack. Muddy, damp, but unmistakably Allison's. Inside were her notebooks, a hairbrush, and a folded flannel shirt she often carried for chilly nights. For investigators, the discovery changed everything. A runaway might take her belongings. But Allison's backpack, abandoned by the water's edge, suggested something far darker. Ravenwood wasn't built to handle a mystery like this. The town's police department was small, its officers more accustomed to handling traffic accidents and minor thefts than a possible abduction. Yet the gravity of the situation was undeniable. Word spread quickly. Church bells tolled for special prayer meetings. Posters with Allison's yearbook photo appeared in grocery stores, diners, and gas stations. Volunteers combed the woods near Maplewood Lake, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as helicopters buzzed overhead. Despite the massive effort, no other trace of Allison was found. For Margaret and Charles, the nights became unbearable. Hannah refused to sleep in her own room, terrified that if she closed her eyes, her sister might return and she wouldn't be there to greet her. The Drakes kept the porch light on, a beacon in the darkness as if guiding Allison home. But deep down they began to sense the truth. Something terrible had happened. The discovery of Allison Drake's backpack at Maplewood Lake sent shockwaves through Ravenwood. What had begun as a missing person report now felt far more sinister. Within hours, the shoreline of the lake was cordoned off with yellow police tape, the kind this town rarely ever saw. Officers paced the muddy ground in boots, careful not to disturb potential evidence, while curious residents gathered at the perimeter, whispering among themselves. The Drake family stood nearby, pale and exhausted, as they watched investigators unzip the canvas bag that had been Allison's constant companion. Inside were her notebooks, school supplies, and a neatly folded flannel shirt. Nothing appeared stolen, nothing seemed out of place, except for the fact that Allison was gone. The bag was carefully placed into an evidence bag, sealed and logged by the department. It would remain preserved for decades, one of the few physical traces of Allison that investigators could hold on to. For Ravenwood, the innocence of small-town life was shattered in that moment. Leading the scene was Detective Samuel Ortiz, a 34-year-old investigator who had recently transferred to Ravenwood from Chicago after years in narcotics. He wasn't a native, and some locals regarded him as an outsider, but his presence brought a seriousness the department lacked. Ortiz crouched near the backpack, his notebook open. He listened carefully as the fisherman described how he'd found it tangled in reeds just before dawn. Ortiz asked about tire tracks, footprints, anything unusual. The man shook his head. Later, Ortiz would say the look on Margaret Drake's face, a mix of dread and disbelief, was what convinced him this case wasn't a runaway. It was something darker. The first 2 days were a blur of activity. Officers organized grid searches of the woods around Maplewood Lake, while helicopters hovered overhead, their spotlights cutting across the water. Boats dragged the lake, pulling up branches and debris, but no sign of Allison. Volunteers showed up by the hundreds. Teachers from Ravenwood High, classmates, parents, and church groups all combed fields and back roads, calling Allison's name into the wind. Flyers bearing her smiling school portrait appeared in grocery stores, diners, and gas stations across the county. But despite the massive effort, there were no footprints, no broken branches, no signs of a struggle. Just the backpack. Inside the Ravenwood Police Department, theories collided. Some officers still leaned toward the possibility of a runaway. Teenagers, they argued, often left home impulsively, especially after arguments or breakups. Others, like Ortiz, were unconvinced. He pressed the Drake family with questions. Did Allison have enemies? Was she in trouble at school? Had she mentioned fear? That was when a new thread emerged. Margaret hesitated, then admitted Allison had recently ended a turbulent relationship with her boyfriend, Brandon Keller, a senior at Ravenwood High. The breakup hadn't been clean. Friends recalled arguments in the school parking lot, Brandon showing up uninvited at Allison's workplace, and heated phone calls that left her shaken. Allison had confided to at least one friend that she was scared of how he might react if she tried to move on. To Ortiz, this detail was significant. It shifted the focus of the investigation. On April 14th, 2 days after Allison vanished, detectives brought Brandon Keller in for questioning. At 18, he was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of restless energy people noticed. He sat across from Ortiz in the small, windowless interview room, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. Brandon admitted they had fought in the weeks before Allison disappeared but denied any involvement in her disappearance. "I didn't hurt her," he repeated, shaking his head. She didn't want to see me anymore. That's it. When pressed about his whereabouts on April 12th, Brandon claimed he had been with friends driving around town. Investigators followed up, interviewing those friends, but their stories were inconsistent. Some said they had dropped him off earlier, others weren't certain of the times. The alibi wasn't airtight. Still, with no physical evidence tying him to Allison's disappearance, police couldn't hold him. For many in Ravenwood, however, suspicion lingered. In the following days, Ravenwood changed. Parents kept their children closer. Girls traveled in pairs, avoiding walking home alone after dark. Conversations in the aisles of Greenfield Market turned hushed whenever the Drakes walked by. Theories swirled. Had Allison been abducted by a stranger passing through town? Had she run away after a fight with her parents? Or was someone close to her responsible? Every family in Ravenwood seemed to have an opinion, but no one had answers. For Margaret and Charles Drake, the waiting was unbearable. They called Ortiz daily, pleading for updates, asking if new leads had surfaced. Charles, once a reserved man, began confronting officers publicly, accusing them of dragging their feet. Margaret, her hands trembling, went on local radio to beg anyone with information to come forward. Hannah, only 13, wandered the house clutching Allison's sweater, unable to sleep in her own room. Each day without answers deepened the family's agony. Ortiz ordered forensic teams to scour Allison's backpack and the surrounding area, but in 1985 forensic science had limits. DNA testing was in its infancy, unavailable to small-town departments like Ravenwood's. The backpack revealed no usable fingerprints, no clear fibers pointing to a suspect, no blood. What they had was circumstantial: a troubled ex-boyfriend, a missing teenager, and a backpack near a lake. It wasn't enough. Local newspapers picked up the story quickly. Headlines in the Ravenwood Gazette read, "High school senior missing, community joins search." Photos of Allison's bright smile stared back from every front page. Television crews arrived from nearby cities, their cameras panning across candlelight vigils and anxious faces. Ravenwood, once anonymous, was now in the spotlight. Ortiz gave brief statements to the press, urging caution and patience. But behind closed doors, he admitted to colleagues that he feared the case was slipping away. Tips poured in. People claimed to have seen Allison at bus stations, diners, even out of state. Each one was investigated, each one fell apart. Witnesses confused Allison with someone else. Leads turned to dust. Brandon Keller remained under suspicion, but with no concrete evidence, investigators couldn't move forward. He returned to school, endured stares and whispers, and graduated that spring with Allison's seat left tragically empty at the ceremony. For Ravenwood, the initial firestorm of activity began to dim. Search parties dwindled, media attention shifted, and the yellow police tape around Maplewood Lake came down. By summer, the case had cooled to a frustrating standstill. Allison's face still looked out from posters, now weathered by rain and sunlight, peeling from telephone poles. The Drakes continued to hold on to hope, but each day without answers felt like another betrayal. Detective Ortiz too felt the weight of failure. Other officers moved on to new cases, but he refused to close the file completely, keeping it within arm's reach on his desk. Late at night, he would flip through the notes again and again, haunted by Allison's unsolved disappearance. Ravenwood was returning to its routines, but under the surface, unease lingered. The question everyone asked, quietly, fearfully, was the same. If someone could make Allison Drake vanish, what did that mean for the rest of them? The summer of 1985 turned to fall, and with it, the urgency around Allison Drake's disappearance began to wane. At first, Ravenwood had rallied with the kind of passion only a small town can summon. But as weeks passed without new evidence, fatigue set in. Search parties dwindled, media crews packed up their cameras, and the flyers with Allison's picture slowly curled and yellowed under the changing seasons. The Drake family, however, could not move on. For them, the silence was unbearable. Margaret and Charles Drake kept Allison's bedroom exactly as she had left it. Her textbooks remained stacked neatly on her desk, the essay she had been working on still tucked in a folder by the lamp. Hannah, barely a teenager, grew up in the shadow of her sister's absence, sleeping with Allison's sweater beside her pillow and refusing to turn off the light at night. Each anniversary of her disappearance was marked with anguish. On April 12th, the Drakes lit candles in the front window, hoping against hope that Allison might somehow walk back through the door. Each year that passed made the ritual more painful. Margaret once told a neighbor, "There's no word for what we are. We're not grieving parents because we don't know if she's gone. We're not whole because she's not here. We live in the middle, every single day." In Ravenwood, the silence bred speculation. For years, whispers about Brandon Keller never really stopped. Some classmates swore they had seen bruises on Allison's arm after arguments with him. Others claimed they had overheard shouting matches in the school parking lot. But suspicion was not evidence. Brandon denied involvement again and again. He graduated that spring, took a job at a local auto shop, and carried the invisible weight of being the boyfriend the police couldn't clear. Some avoided him. Others defended him, insisting the rumors were cruel and unfounded. The Drake family, though, could not shake the thought that Allison's breakup may have been the spark that lit the fire. Detective Samuel Ortiz remained haunted. Officially, the case was marked inactive after months of fruitless leads. The file was placed in the cold case cabinet, where it sat among other unsolved mysteries of the county. But Ortiz refused to let it gather dust entirely. Late at night, long after his colleagues had gone home, he would reopen the folder, reading his own notes again and again. He kept a copy of Allison's school portrait tucked into the back cover of his notebook, a reminder that while the case might have gone cold, the victim was real, her absence a wound that hadn't healed. In 1988, Ortiz was transferred to another division, chasing narcotics cases across the state. But even on the road, Allison's file lingered in his mind. Every time new forensic techniques were mentioned in law enforcement bulletins, he thought of the backpack sealed in the Ravenwood evidence room. The Drakes did not let Allison's memory fade quietly. Margaret became a voice in the community, pushing for continued awareness. She organized annual vigils at the high school football field, where students released white balloons into the night sky. The events drew fewer people each year, but Margaret persisted, even when standing with only a handful of neighbors. Charles grew quieter, more withdrawn. He rarely spoke publicly, but when he did, his words were sharp. "Someone knows what happened to my daughter," he said at a town meeting in 1992. "And until they speak, this town will never be whole." For Hannah, the silence shaped her adolescence. She entered high school with teachers who still remembered Allison, classmates who whispered about her sister's fate, and a community that sometimes treated her as a living reminder of tragedy. By the mid-1990s, whispers of DNA testing were circulating in police circles. For major cases in big cities, the new science was revolutionizing investigations. But in Ravenwood, resources were scarce. Sending evidence for advanced testing was expensive, and Allison's case was not considered active. Ortiz, still keeping one eye on the case, wrote memos urging the department to preserve the backpack under proper conditions. It was one of the few pieces of physical evidence they had, and he believed one day it might speak louder than any rumor. Brandon Keller's life after high school never escaped Allison's shadow. He stayed in Ravenwood, working odd jobs, drifting between relationships, and often drinking heavily. Some described him as angry, quick-tempered, prone to fights in local bars. Others noted that he seemed trapped, unable to leave the past behind. A few even pitted him, believing he was unfairly branded as guilty without proof. But for the Drakes, every time they saw him around town was a painful reminder of unfinished justice. As the years passed, Allison's case became part of Ravenwood's identity. New residents heard the story from neighbors, local kids dared each other to sneak near Maplewood Lake at night, and the Drake family name became synonymous with loss. The case was occasionally mentioned in newspapers, usually on anniversaries, but coverage grew thinner as time went on. Each story carried the same photograph of Allison in her school portrait, smiling forever at 17. By the turn of the millennium, the disappearance of Allison Drake was no longer front-page news. It had become a ghost story, a cautionary tale mothers told their daughters when they stayed out too late. Even as his career advanced, Detective Ortiz could never quite close the mental file. In the early 2000s, when DNA evidence was becoming more accessible, he began quietly lobbying to reopen the Drake case. He argued that the preserved backpack might hold answers that had been invisible in 1985. He wrote in his notes, "Science has caught up. Allison deserves another look." At the time, he didn't know that he was right, that hidden in the fibers of that canvas bag was the key that would one day reopen the door to justice. For nearly 2 decades, Ravenwood carried the silence. The Drakes endured anniversaries, birthdays, and holidays with one chair always empty. Brandon Keller lived under suspicion but outside prison walls. Ortiz kept his obsession alive in the margins of his work. Unbeknownst to them, the answers they thought were buried in time had been preserved all along, sealed inside a backpack in the evidence room, waiting for the day science would finally be able to speak for Allison. By the time the calendar turned to 2003, Allison Drake's case was nearly 20 years old. In Ravenwood, her name was still remembered but rarely spoken aloud. The high school had long since graduated students who never knew her. Maplewood Lake had become a weekend fishing spot again, and new families moved into town unaware that tragedy lingered in the soil. But for Detective Samuel Ortiz, Allison's face never faded. He still carried her school portrait tucked in his notebook, even as his work shifted to other crimes across Illinois. Every time he heard of new forensic techniques, every time a cold case was solved elsewhere through DNA, he thought of the backpack sealed in the evidence locker back in Ravenwood. In early 2004, Ortiz returned to Ravenwood for a departmental meeting. Walking past the evidence storage room, he requested the file for Allison's case. The brown folder was dusty, the photographs inside faded, but the backpack was still there, preserved in its sealed plastic bag. Ortiz asked the obvious question, "Why haven't we tested this?" The answer was what he expected. DNA testing had been prohibitively expensive in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The department's budget had been too small, the backlog of cases too long. But now, with costs dropping and state labs more accessible, the door was finally open. Ortiz filed a request to have the evidence retested. Weeks later, the backpack and its contents were shipped to the state crime lab. The results came back in the spring of 2005. On the fabric of Allison's canvas bag, technicians identified trace amounts of DNA, male DNA. It had been invisible to investigators in 1985, impossible to test with the technology of the time. Now it was crystal clear. The DNA was entered into CODIS, the national database. Days later, the database lit up with a direct match. It was not a stranger, not an unknown drifter. The DNA belonged to Brandon Keller. For Ortiz, it was the moment he had been waiting 2 decades to see. The suspicions that had haunted him since the first interview in 1985 were suddenly given scientific weight. Brandon had touched the backpack, not in passing, not by accident, but in a way that left behind genetic proof. Still, DNA alone would not be enough. Defense attorneys could argue contamination, innocent transfer, or a dozen other possibilities. Ortiz needed more. When news quietly spread that Allison's case had been reopened, Ravenwood stirred. People who had long kept quiet about their suspicions began to speak in hushed tones again. At the diner, waitresses whispered about how Brandon used to follow Allison. At the auto shop, former classmates remembered arguments and slammed doors. It had been 20 years, but memory has a way of hardening, not softening, when guilt hangs in the air. That summer, Ortiz received a call he would later describe as the moment the dam broke. Rachel Thompson, a former classmate of Allison's, had moved out of state years earlier. She was now a mother herself, raising teenage daughters. Seeing their faces brought back the fear she had carried in silence for decades. Rachel told Ortiz that in the weeks before Allison vanished, she had witnessed a chilling moment. Brandon Keller cornering Allison behind the bleachers after school, his voice raised, his body blocking her path. Rachel remembered the fear in Allison's eyes, the way she had brushed it off afterward, insisting she could handle it. At the time, Rachel had been too afraid to come forward. Brandon was popular, intimidating, and she worried no one would believe her. But now, with distance and perspective, she couldn't stay silent. Her testimony, combined with the DNA evidence, began to weave a narrative too strong to ignore. As this case begins to unravel after nearly 2 decades, remember to like and subscribe to the Cold Case Archive, so stories like Allison's are never forgotten, and justice is never left waiting in the dark. Ortiz compiled the new findings: the preserved backpack, the DNA results, Rachel's testimony. He revisited the original interviews, rereading transcripts that suddenly carried new weight. Brandon's alibi, already shaky, now looked like smoke and mirrors. Ortiz interviewed Brandon again in 2006. By then, Brandon was in his late 30s, living in Ravenwood but working sporadically. He denied everything just as he had 20 years earlier. But Ortiz noticed the difference. The bravado was gone. Brandon's answers were clipped, his eyes restless. He seemed less certain, more defensive. Though Ortiz could not yet arrest him, Prosecutors insisted that DNA alone wouldn't secure a conviction without corroborating testimony. He knew the walls were beginning to close in. When Ortiz called Margaret and Charles Drake to tell them the case had been reopened, the silence on the other end of the line was heavy. Margaret finally whispered, "After all this time?" The Drakes had lived through disappointment before. Tips that went nowhere, sightings that turned out false. But this was different. This was science. This was someone finally listening again. Hannah, now grown with children of her own, wept when she heard the news. "It means she didn't just vanish," she said. "It means the truth is still out there." The reopening of the case rippled through Ravenwood. For some, it was a relief, proof that justice had not been abandoned. For others, it was unsettling, especially those who had defended Brandon for years. Old loyalties were tested, old wounds reopened. At Greenfield Market, employees recalled how Allison had laughed and chatted with customers on her final shift. At Maplewood Lake, people stood at the shoreline, remembering the morning the backpack was found. The town that had learned to live with silence was forced to confront the past again. For Ortiz, this was the culmination of 2 decades of persistence. He told colleagues, "If we don't follow this through now, it will never happen." Allison deserves her day in court. With DNA pointing toward Brandon Keller and Rachel Thompson's testimony breaking the silence, Ortiz believed the case finally had momentum. It would take years of patient work, securing testimony, building a case strong enough to withstand trial. But by 2023, nearly 38 years after Allison Drake walked out of Greenfield Market and vanished, justice would finally catch up. Nearly 4 decades had passed since the night Allison Drake vanished, and yet in the spring of 2023, the courthouse in Greenfield was filled with her name once more. Reporters lined the steps, camera crews assembled, and local residents packed the gallery. For the first time in 38 years, Allison's family, her community, and her suspected killer were brought face to face inside a courtroom. The trial of Brandon Keller was about to begin. The path from reopening the case to a trial had been long and grueling. After the DNA results in 2005 and Rachel Thompson's testimony in 2006, prosecutors knew they had a strong foundation. But building a murder case nearly 40 years old required patience. Evidence had to be re-examined, witnesses re-interviewed, and every detail cross-checked against decades of aging memories. Ortiz worked alongside the Bay County State's Attorney's Office, determined to ensure the case would hold in front of a jury. He knew the defense would argue contamination, faulty memory, and the unreliability of old evidence. He wanted every brick in the wall to be solid. By 2021, after years of investigation and legal preparation, prosecutors finally felt confident. A grand jury indicted Brandon Keller on charges of first-degree murder. He was arrested quietly at his home in Ravenwood, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and tired eyes, but still carrying the same defiance Ortiz had seen in him as a teenager. The trial opened in March 2023. Inside the courtroom, tension hung heavy in the air. Allison's parents, Margaret and Charles, sat together in the front row, their hands tightly clasped. Hannah, now in her 50s, sat beside them with her own children, determined to see her sister's name carried through to justice. Brandon Keller sat at the defense table, his expression stoic, jaw clenched. He wore a suit borrowed from his attorney, but the air of small-town familiarity clung to him. Many in the gallery had known him once, some as a high school classmate, others as a face they had passed in the grocery store for years. To them, he was not just a defendant. He was the boy who had once dated Allison, the man who had lived under suspicion all this time. The prosecution's strategy was clear: connect the dots of a story long suspected but never proven. The backpack. Forensic experts took the stand to describe the DNA testing process. Jurors were shown photographs of Allison's canvas bag, the fibers carefully analyzed. The scientist explained how Keller's DNA had been found on the straps, in a position consistent with handling the bag directly. Witness testimony. Rachel Thompson entered the courtroom, her hands trembling slightly as she took her seat at the witness stand. She recounted the confrontation she had seen in 1985, her voice breaking as she described Allison's fear. She explained why she had stayed silent at the time, the intimidation, the worry of not being believed. Her honesty and vulnerability made a powerful impression on the jury. Patterns of behavior. Other former classmates testified, recalling how Brandon had been controlling, how arguments between him and Allison had been frequent and intense. One recalled hearing Allison say she was afraid to break up with him, worried about how he might react. Ortiz's persistence. Finally, Detective Samuel Ortiz himself testified. He walked the jury through the investigation's history, the initial search, the lack of technology in 1985, the long wait, and the eventual breakthrough. His testimony conveyed not just the facts, but also his decades-long determination to see the case solved. Piece by piece, the prosecution built a mosaic of evidence. The DNA, the witness accounts, the patterns of jealousy and control. Together, they painted a chilling portrait of a teenage relationship that ended in violence. The defense attorney, a sharp and seasoned litigator, pushed back hard. He argued that the DNA could have been transferred innocently, that Brandon had once carried Allison's bag while walking her home. He attacked Rachel Thompson's credibility, pressing on the decades-long gap before she came forward. He questioned Ortiz about why the case had gone cold for so long, suggesting the investigation had been sloppy. But with each point raised, prosecutors countered. Forensic experts explained how DNA persists and why accidental transfer was unlikely in this case. Rachel's courage in admitting her delay seemed to strengthen her credibility rather than weaken it. Ortiz's acknowledgement of past limitations only underscored how far science had come, making the jury see the delay as tragic but understandable. For Allison's family, the trial was both excruciating and necessary. Margaret wept silently through Rachel's testimony, hearing echoes of what Allison had endured. Charles sat stiff and unyielding, his anger simmering just below the surface. Hannah, who had grown up in her sister's shadow, felt both vindicated and broken, realizing that the fears she had carried since childhood were finally being spoken aloud in public. Each time Brandon's name was mentioned, the Drakes turned slightly in their seats, as though refusing to grant him the satisfaction of their gaze. The prosecution's closing argument was sharp and emotional. They reminded the jury of Allison's youth, her dreams, her trust in a town that had failed to protect her. They pointed to the DNA as the undeniable link, the silent witness that had waited decades to speak. They urged the jury to see through the fog of time and deliver justice at last. The defense argued that reasonable doubt still remained, that no body had ever been recovered, that memory can falter, that science can be misinterpreted. They warned the jury against convicting a man on circumstantial connections from nearly 40 years ago. After deliberating for 2 days, the jury filed back into the courtroom. The gallery was silent, every breath held. The foreperson stood and read the verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. Gasps filled the room. Margaret clutched Charles's hand as tears streamed down her face. Hannah closed her eyes, whispering her sister's name under her breath. Ortiz, seated in the gallery, allowed himself the faintest exhale of relief. Brandon Keller showed no emotion, his jaw tightening but his eyes betraying nothing. The judge pronounced the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. After 38 years, Allison Drake's case had reached its conclusion. Outside the courthouse, the media captured the scene. Margaret told reporters, "We waited nearly 4 decades for this day. Allison was only 17. She deserved to live her life. Today she finally has justice." Ortiz, standing to the side, reflected quietly, "Cases like this remind us that time doesn't erase truth. It only waits for us to find the tools to uncover it." For Ravenwood, the trial brought closure to a story that had haunted the town for generations. For the Drakes, it was both an ending and a reminder of everything they had lost. Allison would never walk through their front door again, but her story would no longer linger in silence. Justice, though delayed, had arrived. The gavel's echo still lingered in the Greenfield courthouse when the weight of the verdict began to settle. Brandon Keller, once a teenage boyfriend shielded by doubt and silence, had been declared guilty of murder. For 38 years, Allison Drake's story had been a wound that never closed. Now, at last, the town, her family, and the investigators who carried her memory could take a step forward. But the aftermath of justice was not simply relief. It was layered with grief, reflection, and the question that always comes too late. What if Allison had been protected back then? Margaret and Charles Drake walked slowly down the courthouse steps that day, surrounded by family and friends. Margaret carried a framed photo of Allison, the same one that had sat on their mantle for decades, a smiling 17-year-old with her whole life ahead of her. Through tears, she told reporters, "We didn't win today. We didn't get Allison back. But we did make sure the man who took her life finally faced what he did." Charles, his voice gravelly with age, added, "I promised her, even when I prayed at night, that I wouldn't stop waiting for the truth. Today I kept that promise." For Hannah, Allison's younger sister, the verdict was both closure and heartbreak. She thought of the empty chair at every family holiday, the birthdays uncelebrated, the life Allison never lived. She told her children, "Remember this day. Justice can take time, but it matters. Your aunt mattered." Back in Ravenwood, the verdict reopened old conversations. In 1985, many had looked the other way. Some had dismissed Allison's fears, assuming teenage relationships were simply dramatic. Others had been too afraid to confront Brandon Keller, who carried a reputation for temper and intimidation. Now, with the truth laid bare, the town reflected on what it had failed to see. Teachers remembered Allison's smile in the hallways, her friends recalled quiet confessions of unease, and neighbors wondered aloud if they should have spoken up when they sensed something was wrong. At Maplewood Lake, someone placed fresh flowers near the spot where Allison's backpack had been found. At Greenfield Market, employees taped her photo in the break room, a reminder of the coworker they lost. The verdict did not erase guilt, but it transformed silence into conversation. Parents talked to their teenagers about healthy relationships. Schools invited speakers to discuss teen dating violence. Community groups created safe spaces for young people to share their fears without judgment. For Detective Samuel Ortiz, the trial's end was the culmination of nearly 40 years of persistence. In interviews after the verdict, he was asked why he had never given up on the case. He pulled from his notebook the same faded school portrait of Allison he had carried since 1985. "Because she deserved it," he said simply. "Because no one should be forgotten in an evidence room." The case defined Ortiz's career. Younger detectives saw in him an example of tenacity, the reminder that cold cases are not closed cases. They are only waiting for the right moment, the right tool, the right witness to step forward. When Ortiz retired later that year, colleagues honored him with a plaque inscribed with Allison's name. For him, it was not a victory. It was a responsibility fulfilled. His persistence also sparked statewide reforms. Illinois increased funding for forensic testing of old evidence, citing Allison's case as proof that breakthroughs were possible when evidence was preserved. In the months following the verdict, Ravenwood transformed grief into action. Allison Drake Memorial Scholarship. Established by the community and funded by donations, the scholarship supported local students pursuing studies in social work, psychology, and criminal justice, fields dedicated to protecting the vulnerable. Annual Candlelight Vigil. Every April on the anniversary of Allison's disappearance, the town gathered at Maplewood Lake. Residents lit candles along the shoreline, the flickering lights reflected on the water where her backpack had been found. It became both a memorial and a promise to listen when young people spoke of fear. School initiatives. Ravenwood High introduced programs on recognizing warning signs in relationships. Allison's story became a lesson not of tragedy alone, but of vigilance and empathy. Through these efforts, Allison's name became more than a headline. It became a call to action. News of the verdict spread beyond Ravenwood. Statewide papers covered the story, highlighting how DNA had cracked a decades-old case. Advocacy groups pointed to Allison's story as a cautionary tale about ignoring warning signs of abuse. The case sparked discussions in Illinois courts about the handling of cold cases, and lawmakers pushed for increased funding for forensic testing of old evidence. Allison's backpack, once overlooked, became a symbol of what modern science could achieve if evidence was preserved. Legal analysts also noted the significance of the conviction. Even without Allison's body ever being found, the combination of DNA, testimony, and circumstantial evidence had been powerful enough to persuade a jury beyond reasonable doubt. It became a benchmark case for prosecutors nationwide. For Rachel Thompson, the former classmate who had carried her secret for so long, the verdict lifted a weight she had lived with for decades. She admitted publicly that fear had silenced her in 1985, but testifying had allowed her to honor Allison's memory at last. "I couldn't save her then," she told a reporter, "but maybe by speaking now, I helped her family find peace." Her words resonated deeply in the community, inspiring others to share stories they had once buried. Ravenwood would never again be the town that turned away from Allison's cries for help. Neighbors who had once whispered now spoke openly about the responsibility to protect their youth. Former classmates admitted to regrets, but also found healing in finally speaking Allison's name aloud. The trial had not only delivered a verdict, it had reshaped the conscience of a community. In the end, the case of Allison Drake became a story about more than one family's tragedy. It was about persistence in the face of silence, about science finally giving voice to the voiceless, about a town learning that justice may bend but should never break. For the Drakes, the loss would always be there. But with Brandon Keller behind bars, they could finally say their daughter was more than a memory lost to time. She was a life remembered, honored, and fought for. This has been the Cold Case Archive. Thank you for joining us as we preserve these stories one file at a time. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that the memory of these cases lives on.